There is a belief about habit so common it has made its way into nearly every self-help book written, and nearly every piece of advice offered to someone who cannot seem to stop doing something. That habits are the result of choices you made, and that with enough willpower you can unmake them. The problem with this belief is not that it is wrong about the value of effort. The problem is that it is aimed at the wrong brain entirely. The brain that produces your habits is not the brain you use to decide to break them. They are, quite literally, different structures. They run on different rules and respond to different kinds of input. The thinking brain, the one currently listening to these words, and forming intentions and reviewing the day, can suppress a habit for a while at considerable metabolic cost. It cannot eliminate one. That is not a motivational failure or a character flaw. It is an anatomical fact, and understanding why requires knowing what the two structures are built to do. Consider what happened the last time you drove a familiar route. If you have driven it enough times, there is a good chance that at some point during that journey, your attention drifted entirely. You were thinking about something else, a conversation, a problem, nothing in particular. And then suddenly you arrived, and you cannot account for the last several minutes. The car was moving. Hands turned the wheel at the right moments. But you were not there, not in the way you think of being present for something. Something else ran the drive. That other system had been accumulating the drive sequence with every repetition, building a record that did not need the deliberate brain's involvement to run. Roughly half of everything you do on an ordinary day happens without a conscious decision triggering it. The route you walk to your kitchen, the side of the bed you sleep on, the moment you reach for your phone before you have formed a thought about doing so, the specific way you hold a pen or stir a drink or push open a door. These are not choices you are consciously remaking every morning. They are programs running in the background, authored by the accumulated repetition of past days, executing largely without your involvement. And the deeper you look at where those programs live in the brain, the stranger the account becomes. Which structure encodes them, how they are built, why they persist even when you have decided to stop them and the reward is long gone. Why does suppressing a familiar habit take such sustained effort when running the same habit takes almost none? How does the brain take a sequence of dozens of separate actions and compress it into something that fires as a single unit, triggered by nothing more than a particular sound or a particular place? And why, even after years of not doing something, can a single cue restore the urge as if no time has passed at all? If you enjoy exploring questions about the brain and the mind, a like would be highly appreciated. And if something in this raises a question you want to share or a thought you want to put out there, the comments are open for exactly that. Now, let's begin. Think about the first time you drove a route you now take without thinking, or played a piece of music you can now play from memory, or used a keyboard layout you had not encountered before. At the start, every component required deliberate attention. Not because the component was intellectually difficult, but because the brain had no stored procedure for it yet. Each step was a decision that had to be consciously retrieved and executed before the next one could begin. You could not do anything else at the same time. That mode is governed primarily by the prefrontal cortex. This wide band of tissue at the front of the brain handles planning, working memory, and deliberate choice. The behaviors it produces are called goal-directed. Goal-directed behavior has one defining property: outcome sensitivity. What you do depends on what you expect to happen when you do it. If you are about to order food and someone tells you the kitchen is closed, you do not place the order and wait. The brain does not store the action alone. It stores the action paired with its expected outcome as a linked unit. If the value of that expected outcome changes, the behavior changes too. A person operating in goal-directed mode can update their behavior the moment information about the outcome changes, without needing to experience the updated outcome directly. A concrete case makes this visible. You have been stopping at the same cafe on your way to work for months. One morning you learn it has closed. You do not turn that day. You do not need to drive there, find the door locked, and experience the absence before updating your route. The expected outcome disappeared from the model, and the action serving it dropped away. This responsiveness to updated information is the central capability of the goal-directed system. It is what makes deliberate behavior suitable for novel situations and uncertain outcomes, and also what makes it slow. The cost of that flexibility is real. The prefrontal cortex must maintain two representations simultaneously: a model of the intended outcome and a model of where the current action sits in the path toward it. Working memory, the buffer the cortex uses to keep this information active while behavior unfolds, has a well-documented ceiling. Adult working memory capacity sits consistently around 4 discrete chunks of information before earlier items begin to fall out. Any sequence requiring the tracking of more than a handful of steps at once presses against that limit. A person learning to parallel park a car is at that limit in real time. They are tracking the car's position relative to the space, the distance to the vehicle behind, and the current angle of the steering wheel. They are also holding the position of the curb and where they are in the procedure, while correcting for each deviation as it appears. Any one element drops from the working buffer for a moment, and the error compounds. The experienced driver performing the same maneuver is no longer tracking most of those elements explicitly. Their working memory is largely free for what the road around them is doing. The metabolic difference between these two modes shows up in imaging data. People learning novel motor sequences show substantially higher prefrontal activation than experienced performers executing the same physical movements. The muscle use is identical. The brain cost is not. Novices practicing a sequence across a long session show performance that degrades earlier and requires longer recovery between attempts than experts, not because the body tires faster, but because the prefrontal processing governing their execution is running near its capacity limit. What changes across repeated practice is not what happens physically, but where in the brain the instruction originates. An experienced typist's fingers move ahead of conscious awareness. A trained musician's hands navigate a difficult passage while the musician attends to phrasing rather than finger position. These are not inattentive executions. They are executions from which the deliberate mode has gradually withdrawn its close management. Something running faster and at lower cost has taken over the sequence, and the prefrontal cortex has moved from directing to supervising. In familiar conditions with predictable cues, that supervision is largely idle. The structure that has taken over is the striatum. It sits below the cortex, deep inside the forebrain, in a cluster of nuclei that together form the basal ganglia. The striatum is old in the evolutionary sense. It is present in fish and reptiles and amphibians, in any vertebrate that navigates an environment and selects movements based on prior experience. Its function is not abstract reasoning or flexible planning. What it does is link environmental conditions to sequences of motor output. It binds what you encountered to what you did in response, and it gets stronger at that binding with every repetition. Both the prefrontal cortex and the striatum are active from the first attempt at a new sequence. The prefrontal system runs the visible behavior. It sets goals and holds the plan. It monitors outcomes and corrects errors. The striatum runs alongside it, building a parallel record of each repetition, the context that preceded the sequence, The motor output that followed, the outcome that arrived, that record does not enter conscious awareness. It accumulates in the strength of synaptic connections within striatal circuits, invisible to recall, but growing more robust with each pass through the same sequence in the same conditions. The striatum also contains two zones with different functional roles. The zone more closely connected to prefrontal input stays sensitive to outcomes throughout early learning and updates when the outcome changes, much like the goal-directed system does. The zone more remote from prefrontal influence builds a different kind of record, a direct link between stimulus and sequence, insensitive to what the outcome is currently worth. Which of these two zones ultimately drives the behavior depends on how much training has accumulated. Distinguishing between them from the outside requires a test that bypasses the routine entirely and asks whether the outcome even matters anymore. What determines which of the two striatal zones ends up running the behavior comes down to a single variable: the number of times you have performed the same sequence in the same context. Complexity does not predict it. Attentiveness during each repetition does not predict it. How much the behavior mattered to you at the time does not predict it. The amount of training. And inside the striatum, the two zones respond to accumulating repetitions in opposite directions. The zone more closely connected to prefrontal input occupies a region called the dorsomedial striatum. Its connections run to and from the prefrontal cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex, the regions that hold the goal and compute the value of the expected outcome. Because of those connections, the dorsomedial striatum shares a property with the goal-directed system itself. It remains sensitive to outcome value. When it is running the behavior, the action stays linked to the question of what the outcome is currently worth. Updates the value of the outcome and the behavior updates too. This makes the dorsomedial striatum a kind of extended arm of the goal-directed system, running inside the basal ganglia, but still tethered to the outcome evaluations happening upstream. It is also active during early learning in the same way the prefrontal cortex is active. This is the zone engaged when you are still consulting the expected outcome before each repetition of the sequence, still checking whether the result matches what you intended. The zone that does not receive strong prefrontal input sits further out, in a region called the dorsolateral striatum. Its strongest connections come not from the cortex, but from a midbrain nucleus called the substantia nigra, which is part of the dopaminergic circuit that sends signals up into the striatum during learning. The dorsolateral striatum does not compute outcome value. It does not ask what the outcome is worth. What it learns is a simpler association, this context, this cue, and these motor actions in this order. Someone who has typed the same password every day for 2 years may find their fingers begin moving before they have consciously recalled the first character. Once that association is written strongly enough into its circuits, the cue alone is sufficient to trigger the full sequence. Whether the outcome at the end is still worth having is not part of the calculation. Consider what that means in practice. Imagine you have driven the same route to work for 2 years. One morning, the company moves to a different building across town. The goal-directed system updates immediately. New destination, new route, new plan. But for the first several weeks after the move, you may find yourself beginning to take the old route without deciding to. You have to catch yourself. You have to reinsert deliberate control to override what the lower system is still prepared to run. The old route had no goal attached to it anymore. The dorsolateral striatum did not care. The cue was the same, the sequence was the same, and the behavior fired anyway. The functional difference between these two zones was first established by inactivating them separately in animals and observing what changed. When researchers chemically inactivated the dorsomedial striatum before training sessions, animals developed habitual behavior far faster than control animals with intact striata. The braking effect of the goal-directed zone was gone. The dorsolateral system took over earlier, establishing stimulus-response control with fewer training repetitions than the behavior normally required. Removing the dorsomedial striatum accelerated the shift to habit. Inactivating the dorsolateral striatum had the opposite result. Animals trained to a level of extended practice that would normally produce fully habitual behavior still showed outcome-sensitive responding. They were not behaving like animals early in training. The behavior was fast and familiar. But when the outcome was changed, the behavior changed with it. The dorsolateral zone was unavailable, and without it, habit did not form regardless of how much training was applied. The two zones were not simply active at different times. They were the structural substrate of two fundamentally different behavioral modes. What the dorsolateral striatum encodes is not a general tendency to perform a behavior, but a specific link. This context, this cue, this sequence. The same movement performed in a different location or triggered by a different cue does not draw on the same record. This specificity is what makes the system reliable. It fires the right sequence when the right conditions appear, and does not fire when they do not. But the same specificity is what makes the system rigid. Change the context while leaving the behavior unchanged, and the dorsolateral association may not transfer. The cue that fires the sequence in the original context may have no power in a new one. The behavior must either be relearned from scratch in the new context, or the new cue must accumulate its own repetitions to build a new record. In animals with intact striata, recording from neurons in both zones across weeks of training revealed the timeline of the shift. Early in learning, neurons in both the dorsomedial and dorsolateral zones fire across the full sequence of actions. As training continues, the pattern in the dorsomedial zone begins to weaken. The zone is still functional and can be recruited when circumstances change, but its routine contribution to the behavior's moment-to-moment execution diminishes. The dorsolateral zone, by contrast, does not weaken. Its activity sharpens and stabilizes. By the time extended training is complete, the dorsolateral striatum is the primary driver of the behavioral output, responding faster and more reliably to the triggering cue than the dorsomedial zone can. This shift is not just a change in which neurons are active, it is a change in what kind of computation is governing the behavior. When the dorsomedial zone is in charge, the behavior is still answering the question, given what this outcome is currently worth, should I do this? When the dorsolateral zone is in charge, that question is gone from the process. The behavior runs because the cue appeared. The evaluation of whether the outcome matters is simply not part of what gets triggered. From the outside, the two modes look nearly identical. The speed, the fluency, the apparent familiarity of the behavior give no reliable signal about which system is controlling it. A rat pressing a lever for food looks the same, whether it is pressing because it values the food or because the lever appeared, and pressing is the sequence the lever triggers. Only one kind of test separates them. Change the value of the outcome and watch whether behavior changes in response. If it does, the goal-directed system is still in charge. If it does not, the dorsolateral striatum has taken over, and the outcome evaluation is no longer part of what triggers the action. That test required a specific experimental design that had not been used to study the basal ganglia before. Its results made a clean case for something the field had suspected without being able to prove directly, that the same behavior, produced by the same animal in the same context, could be running on fundamentally different neural machinery depending on how long that animal had practiced it. The test that distinguishes goal-directed from habitual behavior was developed at Cambridge, with the core procedure established by Anthony Dickinson and colleagues from the early 1980s, and formalized into the version widely used today by Bernard Berlin through the 90s, and it has since become the standard method in the field for determining which neural system is controlling a behavior at any given point in training. The logic of the test is simple enough to state in a single sentence: make the reward aversive after the animal has learned to pursue it, and see whether the behavior changes. The setup runs as follows. Train an animal, typically a rat, to press a lever for a food pellet. Give it enough sessions that the association between lever and food is well established. Then, in a separate procedure entirely, pair the food pellet itself with a mild injection of lithium chloride. Lithium chloride induces nausea. After a handful of pairings, the animal develops a conditioned aversion to the food. It will not eat it if offered freely. The food that was once valuable is now associated with feeling ill. Having devalued the food, return the animal to the lever without any food present. The lever is there. The association between pressing and the food has been established. The question is whether the animal still presses. In animals trained for a moderate number of sessions, the answer is much less. The goal-directed system has been doing the computing. It holds a model linking the lever press to the food pellet, and it attaches the food pellet to its current value. The current value of the food is now negative. The behavior that once served a positively valued outcome is no longer executed. The animal approaches the lever, perhaps investigates it, but the rate of pressing drops substantially. The outcome evaluation happened upstream, before the action, and the action reflected it. In animals trained for an extended number of sessions, the answer is different. They press at roughly the same rate as before. They have not forgotten that the food made them ill. If offered the food directly, they refuse it. The devaluation worked at the level of explicit consumption, but at the level of the lever press behavior, the food's value is simply not part of what triggers the action anymore. The lever, the context, the familiar testing chamber fires the sequence. The outcome at the end of the sequence is not consulted before the sequence begins. This dissociation is what the test reveals. Two animals trained on the same apparatus, performing the same behavior for the same original reward. One is goal-directed, one is habitual. The behavior looks the same from the outside until you remove the value of the outcome. At that point, only the goal-directed animal stops. The habitual animal keeps going, not because it wants the food, but because the behavior is no longer about wanting the food. Every common-sense account of why an animal performs a trained behavior attributes the behavior to the desire for the reward. The animal presses the lever because it wants the pellet. This is true at the start of training. It is demonstrably false after extended training, in the sense that the behavior continues after the desire for the pellet has been removed. The motivation is no longer the proximate cause of the behavior. The cue is. The human version of this dissociation is something most people have experienced without naming it. Reaching for a bag of crisps during a film and eating several before noticing you have started. Pulling out your phone between one task and the next, not because you wanted to check anything in particular, but because the pause in the task was the cue and the phone check was the sequence. Beginning the usual drive home from work and finding yourself partway along the route before remembering you meant to stop somewhere. These are not decisions, they are lever presses. The cue fired the sequence, and the sequence ran before any evaluation of whether it was what you intended. The devaluation test also reveals something about the architecture of habit that changes how to think about breaking one. If a behavior is habitual in the Belaine and Dickinson sense, then changing your attitude toward the reward is insufficient to change the behavior. The behavior does not run because you want the reward. It runs because the cue appeared. This means that devaluing the reward, or deciding you no longer want what the habit once provided, leaves the critical circuit untouched. The dorsolateral striatum has a record of the sequence that does not update when the outcome's value changes, and that record does not clear when the motivation clears. What this implies is that the most direct route to changing a habit does not involve the outcome at all. It involves the cue, or the context in which the cue appears. Remove the trigger from the environment, or place yourself in a context where the trigger cannot fire, and the sequence has no starting point. This is less intuitive than the common approach of reinforcing your intention not to do the behavior, but the neural architecture suggests it is more direct. The dorsolateral striatum cannot be argued with. It does not receive that kind of input, but it can be interrupted at the moment before the sequence begins. What would clear the record that the dorsolateral striatum holds, and what that actually involves at the level of the neural circuits, requires understanding what the striatum has built during training. The record is not a copy of the action sequence stored as explicit memory. It is something structurally different, encoded in the firing of specific neural populations at specific moments in the sequence. The precise shape of that encoding was not discovered until someone spent years recording from the basal ganglia of rats, running the same maze repeatedly, and noticed something in the data that no one had predicted. Ann Graybiel has spent most of her career at MIT studying the basal ganglia, the set of structures that includes the striatum, and one of the questions that drove her early work was straightforward. What are the neurons in these structures actually doing while an animal learns a behavior? She expected to find steady, sustained activity. The basal ganglia were known to be involved in movement, and movement produces continuous neural firing. As the animal repeated a sequence, she expected to see that firing sharpen and become more reliable, but remain continuous across the duration of the behavior. She was wrong about almost every part of that prediction. The experiment used rats learning to navigate a T-shaped maze. At the start of a trial, a click signaled the opening of a door. The rat ran down the arm of the T, turned either left or right to find a reward at the end, and the trial ended. Electrodes implanted in the striatum recorded the activity of individual neurons throughout each run. In early training, when the rat was still figuring out the task, the neural firing patterns were broad and distributed. Neurons fired across the whole sequence, during the run down the central corridor, during the turn, during the approach to the reward zone. The activity was sustained and relatively continuous throughout the behavior. With extended training, the pattern changed in a way that no one had anticipated. Instead of the neurons becoming more uniformly active or more efficient across the whole sequence, the firing pattern collapsed inward. Neurons that had been firing throughout the run stopped firing in the middle of it. Their activity concentrated at two specific moments: the click of the door at the very start of the sequence, and the moment of arrival in the reward zone at the very end. Between those 2 points, the striatum went neurally quiet. The structure that researchers had expected to be the continuous engine of learned movement was, in the fully trained animal, largely silent for most of the behavior it was supposedly running. The neurons at the start of the sequence fired sharply when the click sounded, as if marking the initiation of something. The neurons at the end of the sequence fired sharply at the food zone, as if marking its completion. Between click and food zone, across the corridor, and the turn that constituted the bulk of the visible behavior, the striatum was not sending the continuous drive that models of motor control had assumed. It was doing something structurally different. Graybiel called these firing patterns bracket signals. They mark the opening and closing of a behavioral unit rather than driving each step within it. The click signal said, "The chunk begins now." The food zone signal said, "The chunk is complete." What ran in between did not require continuous striatal input to unfold. The sequence, once learned, had been packaged into a unit that the bracket signals could open and close without supervising the interior. This reframing of what the basal ganglia do during skilled behavior required a corresponding reframing of what learning produces. Under the earlier model, learning a sequence meant strengthening the neural signal for each step in order. The striatum would learn to drive each step in order. First the corridor, then the turn, then the approach. What Graybiel's data suggested instead was that learning produced a compression. The individual steps did not each acquire a stronger and more reliable neural driver. They were absorbed into a larger unit, and the unit as a whole was what the striatum came to control. The internal steps became the business of lower motor circuits that did not need moment-to-moment management from above. The bracket structure also explained something about the phenomenology of skilled behavior that was difficult to account for in any other way. Skilled performers report a specific kind of knowledge gap about highly practiced sequences. A touch typist who is asked to recite the positions of the keys in order, starting from the home row, frequently cannot do it accurately. A pianist who is asked to play a passage from the middle cannot always start from there. A person who unlocks a door every morning cannot always say, if asked to pause mid-sequence, which key they normally reach for first. The procedural knowledge is there, and the sequence runs. But the individual steps are not stored in a form that supports recall. They are inside the bracket. The bracket can be opened and the sequence runs. The interior of the bracket is not accessible in the way that the fact of having opened it is. The timing of the bracket's emergence matched the timing of the shift from goal-directed to habitual behavior in the Belain and Dickinson sense. The bracket did not appear in early training. It developed over roughly 1 to 2 weeks of daily practice in the rats, emerging as the behavior became fully automatized. Earlier training produced partial bracket signals at the endpoints, while still showing some mid-sequence activity. Only after extended training did the middle go fully quiet. The bracket forming and the habit forming were the same event, observed from 2 different levels, one behavioral, one neural. The bracket signals were not merely descriptive of habit formation. Research that tested their causal role by directly interfering with the circuits that produced them found that disrupting the start and end signals prevented habitual behavior from forming, even in animals that had completed the same amount of training as control animals. Those animals continued to respond in a goal-directed way. They updated their behavior when the outcome changed. Extended training alone did not produce the habit. The bracket structure in the dorsolateral circuit was what extended training was actually building. Behavior without it remained under goal-directed control regardless of how much practice had accumulated. This also explains partial automatization. In that state, the behavior feels easier than early deliberate practice, but is not yet fully automatic. In that intermediate period, the bracket signals are present at the endpoints, but the middle of the sequence is not yet neurally quiet. The striatum has begun building the bracketing structure, but has not yet compressed the interior of the sequence. Full automatization corresponds to the point where the middle goes silent. Until then, The sequence is still partially supervised from above. This also raised a question that the bracket signals themselves could not answer. The signals mark the opening and closing of a behavioral unit. They did not describe what was happening inside. Each sequence the animal ran had a start signal and an end signal, and between them a silence where the striatum had withdrawn from active management. Something was filling that silence. Some circuit was running the interior of the chunk while the striatum held the boundaries. What that circuit was, and what was keeping the deliberate system from intruding while it ran, required a different account entirely. The bracket signals Graybiel found in the striatum mark where a behavioral unit begins and where it ends. What they do not mark is the interior of that unit, and the interior is where the most important question about chunking lives. What is actually happening during the silence? Think of a smart home programmed with a scene preset. You say a single word and a sequence runs. The lights dim in one room and come up in another. The thermostat adjusts. The door alarm activates. The house did not receive a list of instructions, one per action. It received one trigger, and the trigger fired a package sequence. Each action inside the package ran in order, at the right time, without requiring any further input. Each action inside ran silently and in order, without any further input between them. This is why the subjective experience of a chunked behavior feels different from a deliberate one. When you type a password you have used for years, you do not retrieve the characters one at a time. The first character of the password, or even just the presence of the password field, fires the whole sequence. You know the password in the sense that you can type it, but if asked to spell it aloud without typing, you may find you need to mentally simulate the keystrokes to do it. The knowledge is in the chunk, not in the list. The chunk is addressable as a unit. The list is not directly accessible. The same structure explains a phenomenon that most skilled practitioners report, and that appears across domains from sport to music to craftsmanship. When a highly trained performer suddenly thinks carefully about what their hands are doing during a sequence they have long since automatized, performance often deteriorates. The golfer who consciously attends to the position of their elbow during a swing they have made thousands of times may find that their swing breaks apart. A surgeon who narrates each step of a routine procedure they have completed hundreds of times may find their hands hesitate at the moment of narration. The deliberate mode is reinserting itself into a sequence that was running without it, and the two modes do not run well in parallel on the same motor task. The prefrontal cortex is directly involved in that interference. Within the medial prefrontal cortex, there are two anatomically distinct subregions that play opposing roles in the balance between goal-directed and habitual control. The prelimbic cortex, positioned higher in the medial wall, supports goal-directed responding. Its activity is associated with outcome evaluation, and lesions to it shift behavior toward habitual control. The infralimbic cortex, positioned lower, does the opposite. It actively supports habit expression and suppresses goal-directed control. When researchers inactivated the infralimbic cortex in overtrained animals, something notable happened. The animals, whose behavior had by every measure become habitual, reinstated outcome-sensitive responding. They stopped pressing the lever when the food was devalued. The habit had not disappeared. The dorsolateral striatum still held the encoded sequence, but without the infralimbic cortex actively suppressing goal-directed control, the habit did not express. The goal-directed system re-emerged and took the behavior back. This means that habit expression is not the passive absence of deliberate control. It is the active suppression of it. The infralimbic cortex is not simply idle during habitual behavior. It is doing something, holding the goal-directed system down while the dorsolateral striatum runs the sequence. When you execute a chunked behavior without thinking about it, that absence of thought is not a vacuum. It is the product of a specific neural circuit actively keeping deliberate processing from interfering with what the basal ganglia is doing. The infralimbic cortex suppresses the deliberate system, the bracket start signal opens the chunk, and the lower circuits execute the interior of the sequence until the bracket end signal marks completion. The chunk runs as one event from the perspective of the cortex, because that is what the basal ganglia is presenting to the cortex, a single packaged unit with a clear start and a clear end. What caused the bracket start signal to become so reliably associated with the cue, to the point that the click of a door or the sight of a lever could fire the entire sequence, involved a separate learning process playing out in parallel. That process ran in the dopamine system, and its changes across the period of training were as unexpected as the bracket signals themselves. While Graybiel's electrodes were recording from striatal neurons in rats running mazes, a separate line of research was reaching a finding that would turn out to be equally important to understanding what makes a cue capable of triggering an entire behavioral sequence. That research was focused on the dopamine neurons that project into the striatum. Wolfram Schultz at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, the scientist who ran it, was not looking for what he found. Schultz was studying movement in monkeys when he noticed that the dopamine neurons in the midbrain behaved in a way that had nothing obvious to do with movement. These neurons fired when the monkey received an unexpected reward, a drop of juice delivered without warning. That was what he expected. What he did not expect was what happened after the monkey learned that a cue predicted the reward. Once the monkey had learned that a light meant juice was coming, the dopamine neurons stopped firing when the juice arrived. They fired when the light appeared. The timing of the dopamine signal had migrated upstream, from the moment of reward delivery to the moment of the predictive cue. The signal was no longer tracking when something good happened. It was tracking when something good was predicted, and when the juice was predicted but did not arrive, the dopamine neurons dipped below their baseline activity at precisely the moment the juice should have appeared. They signaled a deficit, expected, not received. The animal's dopamine system had, in a very real sense, learned to model the future. It fired at the cue because the cue was when the prediction of the future reward became available. It fell silent at the expected reward time when that prediction failed. Apply this to a habit being built. Early in training, when the animal presses the lever and receives the food pellet, dopamine fires at the moment of the pellet's arrival. This is the signal that reinforces the action. The behavior produced something good, and the dopamine marks that moment. As training accumulates and the lever-pellet association becomes reliable, the click of the door and the sight of the lever begin to predict the sequence, and as they do, the dopamine signal migrates. By the time the behavior is habitual, the cue alone fires the dopamine response, the click that marks the opening of the door. The pellet's arrival, now fully predicted, produces no new dopamine signal of its own. This migration is not a curiosity. It is what gives the cue its power to trigger the full behavioral sequence. The click is no longer just a signal that the maze is open. The click has become, through repeated association, a dopamine trigger. The dopamine fires in the striatum at the moment of the click, reinforcing the bracket start signal and priming the circuits that run the chunk. The cue fires dopamine before the run even begins. The behavior starts in the brain before the animal's body has moved. The dopamine pathway most directly implicated in the habitual, stimulus-response component of this process is the nigrostriatal pathway, running from the substantia nigra in the midbrain up into the dorsolateral striatum. Schultz's original recordings were from neurons in the ventral tegmental area projecting via the mesolimbic pathway to the nucleus accumbens and related structures, the circuit more closely associated with reward motivation and wanting. The nigrostriatal pathway is specifically associated with habitual learning in the dorsolateral striatum because it provides the dopaminergic input to the structure that encodes stimulus sequence associations. When the cue fires dopamine through the nigrostriatal circuit into the dorsolateral striatum, it reinforces the link between cue and sequence rather than driving motivation toward a valued outcome. The cue has become, through repeated association, a trigger that fires the behavioral sequence through the habitual circuit before deliberate processing has been consulted. Consider a building access card used the same way every morning for 2 years. At first, you consciously bring out the card as you reach the reader. You are aware of the goal, the closed gate, and the action that opens it. After years of daily repetition, you will find that your hand moves toward your badge before you have formed any explicit intention about the gate. The approach to the entrance is the cue. The dopamine signal fires at the moment of that approach. Your hand is already moving. The reader, the badge, the swing of the gate are the interior of the chunk that the approach cue has opened. You arrive at your desk, sometimes having no clear memory of having passed the gate at all. The migration of the dopamine signal to the cue is also why old cues are so persistent as habit triggers, even after years of disuse. The dopamine response conditioned to a cue does not simply fade when the behavior is discontinued. The association in the dorsolateral striatum persists in latent form. Re-exposure to the cue, even years later, fires the dopamine signal and the brackets start response. The sequence is still there, still keyed to the same trigger. The behavior may not emerge, but the neural priming does. What that means for the experience of habitual behavior is less abstract than the neural account makes it sound. When you encounter a cue that your dorsolateral striatum has linked to a sequence, the dopamine fires before you have formed any decision. The body begins to move toward the behavior before the deliberate system has been consulted. The feeling of being drawn toward a familiar behavior by a familiar condition is not a metaphor for something psychological. It is the cue-triggered dopamine expressing itself as preparation for motor output. The deliberate system can interrupt this, but by the time the interruption arrives, the vote has already been cast. The practical implication of this is that reducing exposure to the cue reduces the frequency with which the dorsolateral circuit is activated. An environment rearranged to remove the triggers for an unwanted sequence is one in which the cue-triggered dopamine signal fires less often. The association may still be encoded, but an association that is not being activated is not being rehearsed, and the neural link can weaken over time without being erased. The cue loses some triggering power, not because the record has been cleared, but because the record has not been refreshed. Cue management is not willpower at the moment of the trigger. It is upstream design, arranging conditions so the trigger appears less often. The dopamine prediction error that built the habit does not run forever. It has a terminal state. What happens to the behavior when that signal closes is not what most models of reinforcement would predict. The migration of the dopamine signal from reward moment to cue completes when the behavior has become fully predictable. At that point, the cue has reliably predicted the food pellet, and there is nothing left for the dopamine system to learn. The prediction error has closed. The gap between expected and actual has gone to zero. A prediction error of zero means the reward, when it arrives, produces no new dopamine signal. The pellet drops into the tray. Nothing happens in the dopamine neurons that was not happening already. The reward is fully expected, so there is nothing to signal. The dopamine response that once reinforced the behavior with every trial has moved entirely to the beginning of the sequence and no longer fires at the end. This zero-error state is not the end of the habit. It is the maintenance state. The cue still fires the dopamine response at the bracket start. The dopamine still primes the dorsolateral circuits that run the chunk. The sequence still executes. But it is no longer being updated by the reward signal. The reward arrives or fails to arrive, and the sequence is equally ready to run on the next trial either way. The habit has decoupled from the reward at the level of learning, while remaining connected to the cue at the level of triggering. This decoupling produces a specific consequence that shows up in the subjective experience of established habits. The behavior can run without anything particularly satisfying happening at the end. The person checking their phone first thing in the morning before they have formed any intention about doing it is executing a cue-triggered chunk. The phone may contain nothing notable, no message, no new information, nothing that provides the satisfaction that might have motivated the habit in the first place. The cue was the phone alarm. The dopamine fired at the alarm. The check happened. Whether the check delivered anything is irrelevant to whether the sequence runs next time. The maintenance circuit has another property that matters here. A prediction error of zero is not the same as an absence of learning signal. If the reward is omitted when the animal expected it, the dopamine neurons dip below their baseline activity at the exact moment the reward should have arrived. This negative signal is not neutral. It actively suppresses the behavior associated with that moment, reducing the probability that the animal will run the sequence next time under the same conditions. It is a penalty signal, not just the absence of a reward signal. The dopamine system does not simply stop caring when the expected reward fails to appear. It registers the failure precisely. Consider what that means for the maintenance of a habit. A habit that reliably delivers its original reward generates no new learning signal at the reward moment, because the reward is fully predicted. A habit that delivers no reward at all generates a negative signal at the reward moment, but a habit that delivers a reward only sometimes, unpredictably, never allows the prediction to fully form. The prediction error never reaches zero. The dopamine signal is never fixed entirely at the cue. Some fraction of the dopamine response still fires at the reward moment on the trials when the reward appears, because the reward was not fully predicted. This partial, irregular reinforcement produces a pattern of dopamine signaling that is more resistant to extinction than either full or zero reward delivery. The behavior is being reinforced on an uncertain schedule, and uncertain schedules produce the most persistent behavioral patterns the conditioning literature has documented. This is not incidental to how many habitual behaviors in daily life are structured. Social media platforms deliver variable rewards on unpredictable schedules. Sometimes the feed is interesting, usually it is not. The cue-triggered dopamine fires at the check regardless. The occasional reward keeps the prediction error alive at the reward moment. The sequence gets a partial reinforcement on some trials and a small negative signal on others, and the result is a behavioral pattern that persists without requiring the reward to be consistently delivered. The variable schedule effect was first systematically documented in operant conditioning research under the label of the variable ratio schedule. In a fixed ratio schedule, every nth response delivers a reward. In a variable ratio schedule, Rewards arrive after an unpredictable number of responses. The number required before each reward varies, with no signal about when the next one will come. Variable ratio schedules produce more resistant behavioral patterns than any fixed schedule, and the resistance persists long after rewards stop entirely. The behavioral pattern that makes slot machines difficult to stop using and social media feeds difficult to put down is the same structure that makes variable reinforced habits the hardest to extinguish. The prediction error never closes to zero. The brain keeps expecting that the next trial might be the one that delivers. The habit stays in a partial acquisition mode rather than reaching the stable zero-error maintenance state. It continues being reinforced on an uncertain schedule without ever fully settling. The fully consolidated habit runs in a pure maintenance mode. The cue fires dopamine. The dopamine opens the bracket, and the chunk executes. The reward arrives without generating any new signal. The behavior is stable, self-sustaining, and requires neither motivation nor reward evaluation to run. What it does require is the cue. Remove the cue, or move the behavior to a context where the cue is absent, and the habit has no entry point. The bracket never opens. The sequence never fires. The record in the dorsolateral striatum is intact, but it cannot read itself. What that record actually looks like, and whether it can be erased, becomes the question that matters most once the habit is established. The assumption that behavioral extinction clears it is wrong in a specific and important way. The most common assumption about what happens when a habit stops is that it is replaced by a new pattern that writes over the old one. Stop the behavior long enough, build a new response to the same cue, and the old habit is cleared. This assumption turns out to be wrong in a specific way that has significant consequences for understanding why habits return. When an animal is put through extinction by receiving nothing after each press until pressing stops, something happens in the behavior. Something different happens in the brain. The behavior stops. The neural record does not clear. Graybiel's lab recorded from the dorsolateral striatum of animals through training, extinction, and beyond. After extinction was complete and the animals were no longer pressing the lever, the bracket signals were still there. The neurons that had fired at the start and end of the sequence were still firing in that pattern when the animal encountered the old cue. The sequence was not running, but the ensemble of neurons that encoded it was still active in the familiar bracket shape. The behavior had been suppressed. The striatal record had not been rewritten. Old habits in this sense resemble cobblestones beneath new asphalt. The old paving is beneath the new surface, and it does not decompose. Apply enough disruption and wear to the top layer, and the old stones begin to show through. The root is still there. It was never removed, only covered. What extinction produces is not erasure. It produces a competing memory, encoded in a different circuit, that overrides the old response when that circuit is active. The new inhibitory memory is encoded in prefrontal circuits that reassert during extinction and override the dorsolateral striatum's expression of the old sequence. Prefrontal suppression holds the old pattern down while the new non-pressing response is expressed. But holding something down is not the same as removing it. The old record exists beneath the new behavior, structurally intact, waiting for conditions under which the suppression lifts. Those conditions are common. A delay of several weeks without any further training often produces spontaneous recovery. The behavior reappears at partial strength without any reinstating event. A change of context produces renewal. An animal extinguished in one chamber reverts to the old behavior, when returned to the original training context, because the new suppression learning was context-specific. A single priming event, a single unreinforced exposure to the cue or the food, can rapidly reinstate the full behavior. Each of these phenomena points to the same structure. The original behavioral record is intact in the dorsolateral striatum, and what changed during extinction was not that record but the neural filter over it. The HM case, one of the most studied individuals in the history of neuroscience, made the independence of the striatal record clear from a completely different angle. Henry Molaison underwent bilateral removal of much of his hippocampus in 1953, following surgery intended to treat severe epilepsy. The operation achieved its goal but left him unable to form new episodic memories. Events that happened after the surgery did not accumulate into a retrievable record. Each day, each session, each conversation began without any conscious recollection of what had preceded it. He could not learn new facts in the conventional sense. What he could do was acquire new procedural skills. In repeated sessions of mirror drawing, a task requiring the learner to guide a pencil along a star shape while viewing their hand only in a mirror, HM improved across days and weeks. His performance on the task got better, but he had no memory of having done the task before. Each session, when presented with the apparatus, he described himself as seeing it for the first time. He showed the researcher an improved performance and had no conscious access to the learning that produced it. Brenda Milner at McGill, who studied Molaison for decades, noted that the mirror drawing improvement was not incidental. Over repeated sessions, his accuracy improved and his error rate fell. By any standard measure of procedural learning, the striatum was doing its work normally across the gap his episodic memory could not bridge. When he was shown his performance records, he was surprised. He had no account of why he should be competent at a task he had never, as far as he knew, attempted. The learning was there. The memory of acquiring it was not. His case also demonstrated something more general about how the striatal record forms. It builds without informing the systems responsible for conscious memory at any stage of the process. A person forming a habit is not consciously encoding a habit alongside the episodic memory of the repetitions. The striatal record forms in parallel with what the hippocampus retains, and it does so without derivation from the episodic content. This means that reviewing your own behavior does not interrupt the striatum's record-building process. Reflecting on what you are doing and why runs in the deliberate system, the striatal record accumulates in the other regardless. The striatum had built its record independently of the hippocampus. The procedural record did not require episodic memory to form, to accumulate, or to express. The skill lived entirely outside the structures damaged in the surgery, encoded in a form that did not need conscious recall to be used. HM knew how to do the task in the only sense the striatal system understands. The cue appeared, the chunk ran, and the performance was there. Whether he remembered doing it had no bearing on whether he could do it. This separation of systems matters because it means the striatal record is not accessible to the kind of reasoning that applies to conscious memory. You cannot argue with it, reason about it, or update it by reflecting on your intentions. It does not know what you think about the habit. It knows the cue, and when the cue appears, it runs the sequence. The conditions that determine whether the sequence runs lie upstream. Both striatal systems are running simultaneously from the moment the cue appears, and which one controls the output depends on a competition that the cue itself initiates. Both striatal systems run in parallel at all times rather than taking turns. What determines which one controls behavior in any given moment is a competition between them. When you reach for your phone before any intention has formed, both are already running. The dorsolateral circuit has triggered the familiar sequence, while the dorsomedial system continues computing in the background whether the action is currently worth taking. The behavior that actually emerges is determined by which system wins that competition in that moment, under those conditions. In normal conditions with moderate demands, the balance between the two systems is flexible. A person driving a familiar route can do so habitually, while also exercising deliberate control when the situation requires it, catching the unusual condition, taking the detour, stopping when the light changes unexpectedly. The goal-directed system has not been fully displaced. It monitors from the background and can reassert itself when the routine is violated. The habitual system handles the predictable stretches. The goal-directed system handles the deviations. What changes the balance is resource. The goal-directed system is metabolically expensive, requires sustained prefrontal engagement, and is sensitive to load. When the cognitive load is high and fatigue is present, the resources available to the goal-directed system are reduced. Time pressure and competing demands compound this further. The dorsolateral striatum does not have this limitation. It fires from a lower activation threshold and does not require working memory, outcome modeling, or attentional monitoring to run its sequences. When the deliberate system is weakened, the habitual system does not have to compete as hard to win. This shift has been studied most clearly in the context of stress. A study by Lars Schwaber and Oliver Wolf at Ruhr University Bochum found that acute stress selectively shifted behavior from goal-directed to habitual control. Animals and human participants under stress showed less sensitivity to outcome devaluation than their unstressed counterparts. Under stress, the behavior ran even when the outcome was no longer valuable, exactly as the habitual system produces. Under no-stress conditions, participants updated when outcomes changed. Under stress, they did not. Stress did not impair the behavior. It changed which system was running it. The neural mechanism for this shift involves the stress hormone corticosterone, released by the adrenal glands during acute stress. Corticosterone acts on receptors in the infralimbic cortex, the same medial prefrontal subregion that suppresses goal-directed control and enables habitual expression. Elevated corticosterone enhances infralimbic cortex activity, pushing the balance further toward the dorsolateral system. The habit-enabling circuit is activated by the same signal that the body uses to manage threat. Stress and habit expression share a common trigger. This architecture explains a pattern that clinical practitioners have observed for decades without a precise mechanism for it. People with established problematic habits consistently report that those habits are hardest to resist when they are stressed, tired, or cognitively overwhelmed. The behavior ran because the resources that let the goal-directed system stay in the lead had run short, and the dorsolateral circuit won by default. The dorsolateral striatum does not need the person to be weak. It needs the prefrontal system to be stretched thin. The clinical implications extend further. In conditions where the dorsolateral system is chronically overactivated, or the prefrontal system is chronically underactive, the balance tips permanently, not just under acute stress. Obsessive-compulsive disorder involves sequences of behavior running against the person's explicit wishes, with corticostriatal circuits driving compulsive sequences that the prefrontal system cannot reliably suppress. Substance use disorders involve cue-triggered sequences that survive years of abstinence and are reinstated by exposure to original cues because the dorsolateral record persists intact. Certain eating disorders involve habitual food-seeking behaviors that run independently of hunger signals because the behavior decoupled from its motivational basis during the period of its formation. The same neural architecture that makes habits useful is the architecture that can run behaviors the person no longer wants. The common thread in each of these clinical patterns is that the behavior being expressed is not chosen at the moment of expression. The person with OCD who performs a checking sequence has not decided that checking is the right response to the current situation. The person returning to a substance after months of abstinence has not made a cost-benefit calculation that favors returning. The sequence was encoded in the dorsolateral striatum. The cue appeared. The sequence ran. What separates these cases from everyday habitual behavior is not the mechanism. It is the degree to which the dorsolateral circuit has become dominant and the extent to which the suppressive capacity is unable to hold it. Research on the neural basis of these conditions has found elevated dorsolateral striatal activity and reduced connectivity between the prefrontal regions responsible for suppression and the circuits they need to regulate. The imbalance that produces a clinically problematic behavioral pattern is quantitatively greater than the imbalance that makes you reach for your phone before you intended to, but the mechanism is the same. What all of these share is the persistence of the dorsolateral record and the insufficiency of prefrontal suppression alone to clear it. The infralimbic cortex can hold the dorsolateral circuit down, but suppression is not elimination, and suppression has a ceiling. When the suppressive force weakens, the behavior emerges again. The record is still there. The bracket is still keyed to the cue. The sequence is waiting for the conditions that allow it to run. The deliberate system, the one currently listening to this explanation, is not powerless in this architecture, but understanding where its power actually lies and where it demonstrably does not changes what kind of intervention makes sense. Willpower is a prefrontal system function. It operates through the same cortical circuits that handle goal-directed behavior, setting a course, holding an intended outcome in mind, inhibiting actions that conflict with it. As an account of habit interruption, it reaches into the wrong structure. Not because willpower does not exist, but because the prefrontal cortex does not have direct right access to the dorsolateral striatum, and the dorsolateral striatum is where the habit lives. What the prefrontal cortex can do is suppress the output of the dorsolateral striatum. The infralimbic cortex, which normally enables habit expression by holding down the goal-directed system, can itself be overridden by upstream prefrontal input under sufficient motivational conditions. This is why willpower sometimes works in the short term. Deliberate suppression of the habit expression is possible. The behavior has been inhibited, but the striatal record is not gone. The bracket signals are still there, the dopamine still fires at the cue, and the sequence is still primed. The circuit that would produce the behavior has not changed. This is also why willpower fails at the times and places it matters most. Stress, fatigue, and time pressure are the conditions that Schwaber and Wolf showed shift behavior toward habitual control. Each reduces the resources the prefrontal system needs to sustain suppression. The dorsolateral circuit has a lower activation threshold. When the suppressive force runs short, the circuit that was only held back fires. The behavior returns because the neural architecture produced what its resource levels made probable. Suppression ran out before the dorsolateral circuit did. There is a widespread belief, with roots in a 1960 book by plastic surgeon Maxwell Maltz, that habits take 21 days to form. Maltz observed that his patients took a minimum of around 21 days to adjust to their changed appearances, extrapolated to habit formation generally, and the minimum qualifier disappeared in every subsequent repetition of the claim. Philip Halali at University College London tracked 96 participants for 12 weeks as they established a self-chosen behavior and found that automaticity developed over a range of 18 to 254 days, according to the paper's modeling of each participant's habit curve, with a mean around 66 days. Simple behaviors took less time, complex behaviors took more. Missing a single repetition did not significantly affect the trajectory. The 21 days figure is not a study finding. It is a retelling of a retelling, with the word minimum dropped early and never recovered. What Lally's data describes is the time required for the dorsomedial system to build a strong enough goal-directed association that the behavior becomes reliable in the target context. It is not describing the time until the dorsolateral system takes over. That shift takes longer and depends on context consistency. The same cue and the same sequence repeated enough times that the dorsolateral circuit encodes the link strongly enough to run without prefrontal direction. The 40 or 60 or 90 days that people report as the time needed to establish a new habit is the time the new behavior spends in the deliberate phase before it begins to automatize. Working on a behavior while leaving its cue intact is like trying to stop a river while leaving the source untouched. The behavior keeps flowing because the conditions that drive it have not changed. What actually changes a habit is not working on the routine. The routine is the interior of the bracket. The sequence has an entry point. That entry point is the cue. If the bracket is never opened, the routine never runs. Effective habit change at the neural level involves targeting the cue or the context that fires it. Remove the cue from the environment entirely, and the bracket never opens. This is context change, moving to a new city, starting a new job, reordering the physical space so that the environmental trigger no longer appears. Studies of people who changed major habits found that natural life transitions, events that disrupted the cue context regardless of intention, produce significantly more habit change than explicit intention setting in the same environment. The trigger was gone. The sequence was never initiated. Where cue removal is impossible, cue reassignment is the next most effective approach. Identify the cue and consistently pair it with a different sequence until the new sequence begins to automatize. This is not replacing one habit with another in any simple sense. It is building a competing dorsolateral association on the same cue, and doing so with enough repetitions in the right context that the new association eventually wins the competition consistently enough to dominate. This takes time because it requires the dorsolateral circuit to build a new procedural record, not because the old one is being removed. The repetition requirement explains something that people often experience as failure. Early in the reassignment period, the new sequence feels effortful and deliberate, while the old one feels easier. That is an accurate reflection of what is happening. The new sequence is still running through the goal-directed system, which requires prefrontal engagement and conscious direction. The old sequence is still running through the dorsolateral circuit, which requires none of those things. The competition is not fair at the start. The old sequence has a lower activation threshold and no requirement for attention. The new sequence starts at a disadvantage that only accumulated repetitions can close. What closes it is not insight, motivation, or willpower sustained. It is repetition of the new sequence in the presence of the old cue until the dorsolateral circuit has built a record of the new association strong enough to win consistently. The deliberate system is needed to produce each repetition until automatization begins. After that, the new sequence runs from the cue with the same absence of effort the old one had. The brain does not improve the old habit. It builds a second one that outcompetes it. The first remains. In conditions of stress where the suppressive capacity is reduced, it will always be faster to activate. But under normal conditions, the new one is what runs. The prefrontal cortex is not irrelevant to this process. Setting the intention, designing the new context, and maintaining the new behavior until it automatizes all require prefrontal engagement. But the prefrontal system is the architect, not the mechanism. It designs the conditions under which the dorsolateral system can write a new record. Trying to use it as the mechanism to run willpower against the habit long-term is asking the expensive system to do what only repetition in a changed context can accomplish. The car is moving through familiar streets. Hands are making the right corrections. The route is completing itself, while attention is somewhere else entirely. The dorsolateral striatum held the encoded sequence. A cue fired the bracket start signal, the familiar stretch of road and the particular junction that marks the transition into the run home. The infralimbic cortex held the deliberate system down. The lower motor circuits ran the interior of the chunk. The bracket end signal fired in the reward zone, your driveway. Your prefrontal cortex, freed from the task of driving, was available for whatever was occupying it instead. This is the function the habit system is built for. The brain is metabolically constrained. It uses a disproportionate share of the body's available energy for its size, and the prefrontal cortex is the most expensive part of it to run at full capacity. An organism that had to run deliberate, goal-directed processing for every behavior in every waking hour would exhaust its prefrontal resources before midday and have nothing left for the tasks that actually require flexible reasoning. Habits are the brain's way of running the predictable on a cheaper system, so the expensive one stays available for the unpredictable. The behaviors that became habitual in that environment were ones that had paid off reliably in stable conditions: routes, foraging patterns, social sequences that worked. The cues that triggered them were embedded in the physical world and changed slowly. A habit formed to the smell of a particular place or the sight of a particular person would be re-triggered by the same conditions reliably. The system was well matched to its environment. The environment many people now inhabit has a different relationship with cues. Notifications are designed to be salient triggers. Products are designed to appear in contexts that have been mapped to cue-triggered wanting. Spaces are arranged to maximize the appearance of triggers for sequences that produce revenue. The human habit formation system is the same one that encoded routes and foraging patterns. It is now operating in a landscape that has been deliberately engineered to fill it with cues at a density and sophistication far beyond what the system was shaped against. This does not change the architecture. The dorsolateral striatum still responds to cue repetition in the same way. The infralimbic cortex still enables habit expression under the same conditions. Stress still shifts the balance toward the habit system. The record, once written, still persists after extinction. None of this is altered by knowing it. What changes is where the prefrontal system can usefully direct its limited capacity. The patterns currently encoded in your dorsolateral striatum were not chosen in any direct sense. They accumulated from repetition in contexts that existed before you thought about them, building records that do not require your conscious participation to run. They are running now. The sequences encoded there are keyed to cues and primed to fire at the first appearance of their triggers, waiting for the conditions under which the bracket opens. A record written years ago, and since suppressed, waits on the same terms. The bracket is still keyed to its original cue. What you can choose within the constraints of the architecture is not the routine. The routine runs once the bracket is open. What you can choose is what triggers are in your environment, what context you place yourself in, and where you concentrate enough repetition that the dorsolateral system builds the records you actually want it to hold. That is the narrow place where the deliberate system and the habitual one make contact, not in the moment the sequence runs, but in the design of the conditions that determine what sequences the brain encodes. If you found this episode useful, subscribing would mean more episodes like this one reach you.